Hello everyone, this is Savannah Bekowski, Project Assistant at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar entitled Succession Planning. This session is one of several webinars conducted by the Environmental Finance Center Network for the Smart Management for Small Water Systems project. The EFCN provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all 50 states and 5 territories to help local water systems achieve and maintain compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And here you can see the various centers that make up the Environmental Finance Center Network. You can see that the centers are spread all across the country, from New York to Kansas to California. And here you can see the areas of expertise that the EFCN focuses on. Workshops, trainings, and direct assistance are provided on asset management, energy management and planning, financial management, leadership through decision-making and communication, managing drought, water loss reduction, collaborating with neighboring communities, multi-funding, water conservation, management and finance 101, climate resiliency, and workforce development. The EFCN also has a small systems blog. You can learn more about water and finance management through this blog. Blog posts feature lessons learned from our training and technical assistance, descriptions of available tools, and small system success stories. You can view this blog at the web address available at the bottom of this slide. You will also have the opportunity to subscribe to the blog at the end of the webinar. And at this point, I would like to turn the presentation over to our speaker today. Today, we have Chris Dotson, Associate Director at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Chris, welcome and take it away.
Great, thanks, Savannah. We have somewhat duplicate slides here, so let me just fast forward to where I'm going to begin, which is talking about one other resource we have, which is our funding table. So we have developed a funding table for every state in the United States of America and listed all of their state-level funding resources available and the contact information for the program managers for each of those. So here is a screenshot of our website that you can that shows you how to navigate to the funding table. So first, go to efcnetwork.org and then select under Resources, Funding Sources by State. And that will lead you to this map, and then you would just click on the state that you're most interested in, and you'll see there's to the left of this slide, there's a very small, obviously not full-size version of what would come up when you click on that state. And again, that's a listing of all available funding sources for focused on water utilities. All right, so the purpose of our discussion here today is succession planning. Because I took a look at the registration list yesterday, and then again today, to get a feel for the types of folks who are on this call, and the polling questions that Savannah just had you go through also helps me to understand who's on the call. That said, for some of the utilities, this may look like an awful lot of work. For others, it may seem like just the tip of the iceberg in getting started on succession planning at the utility level. I assure you that any utility of any size would benefit from exercising a succession planning process. And we can work with you in determining the right size of what that succession planning process could be for your utility. So if there's one operator or there's 20 with a support staff and lab and other folks, I mean, you can find the succession planning process that's right for your community. So everybody should do succession planning, though it's very important and critical for making sure that your utility continues to operate and has the resources it needs to deliver your critical service to your community. So one of the first steps in succession planning, obviously, is identify who's leaving. What jobs are likely to experience retirements in the next 5 years, and what would be the impact? How long have those people been there? What kind of licenses and experience do they have? Do they manage other staff? And it's just not retire. It's just retirements aren't the only thing to think about. Sometimes people leave abruptly, and thinking about whether or not you have the resources or whether you have the recruitment pool to replace them. But one thing is always true: employees leave. They always do. And preparation for that day is essentially called is basically what succession planning is. So this kind of flow chart here to the right shows some of the some of the steps in succession planning. So, obviously identifying the positions that you have, and again, it's important not to make it about the individual, about the person, but about the position, because you may find as you go through the succession planning process that maybe some positions can be merged or eliminated or pivot into a different direction based on the needs of the utility. When you think about the person, say Carl is retiring as operator. Okay, so we need to just replace Carl. You don't necessarily, well, what about this position? Is there a way we can make this position something different now that we have the opportunity that Carl's retirement has given us? So identify positions, identify the knowledge, KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities. And so when you think about the position, you're thinking also about the knowledge, skills, and abilities of that position, and then also the knowledge, skills, and abilities you may need throughout the utility and in other positions, even in the future. Then you assess the people that you have for positions, for knowledge, skills, and abilities, develop your succession plan, and then implement and monitor it. There's some critical components to think about. So this webinar today is an hour discussion on succession planning. It's but one component of our workforce development curriculum that is a 2/3 day training, where we also include recruitment and retention, leadership development, knowledge sharing and capture. So all of those other components are really critical in building you up to the point where succession planning can begin. And you'll find once you develop a succession plan that recruitment and retention are critical components of that plan. So they both serve as the foundation, but also as part of the process of succession planning. There are many, many barriers to meeting staffing requirements, capacity, sometimes compensation, residency requirements, collective bargaining. Maybe you just don't have many candidates in your candidate pool. It's very small. Or perception of the industry can sometimes harm us all. Education, training. But the benefits of succession planning largely greatly outweigh the costs. So again, depending on the size of your utility, and I know some of you aren't even utilities, some of you are from the private sector or from other industries, depending on the size of your organization, your utility, that cost is highly variable. If you're a small utility with 5 or 4 or 14 employees, the cost may be only in-house time. And of course that can come with some lost productivity if you're focused on planning instead of doing your job day to day. But some larger utilities may benefit from hiring a consultant to help them develop their succession plan. And folks like the Environmental Finance Centers, we have a lot of tools to help you identify, A, what's the right size plan for us, and then we also have a lot of tools and handouts and other things that I'd be happy to share with you so that you can understand exactly how much effort is going to be required and whether the effort for you would be in-house or whether you'd hire a consultant or some combination of the two. But look at the large number of benefits here. I'd like to start with the customer benefits. because I think sometimes we forget about those. When we have strong, skilled workers in stable employment positions, we can ensure great customer service and efficient service and good responsiveness and a better run organization. And all of those things obviously improve morale and communications and effectiveness and working relationships and growth in the employee. And then the employer, stabilized performance, strong workforce. It makes you the employer of choice, and then increased organizational resiliency, capacity, et cetera, et cetera. So there's great benefits to doing this. And at the end of the day, it makes us less vulnerable as utilities when we know what the next step is going to be should certain positions become unfilled. The challenge often is the challenge that creates the need for succession planning is essentially a lot of our operators are nearing retirement. You know, the baby boom generation, the folks who have been sometimes working in these positions for a very long time, are getting to the point in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, 10, where retirement seems like an option for them. We're also having, as an industry, a really hard time at communicating to younger folks just how great it could be working in a water utility. And in some of the workshops that I've developed and offered, I've asked folks how they ended up getting into the water industry. And it isn't such a straight and narrow path, and I'm sure many of you know that. So we have to sometimes think creatively about how we recruit folks into positions that we know we're going to need help with in the future. So some of the other pressing problems, and these were identified by a Water Environment Association survey last year. Employee retention, often because of compensation and lack of potential advancement. Heavy reliance on on-the-job training rather than formal training and development. Weak or non-existent leadership development programs, loss of institutional knowledge, complications with bargaining agreements. These are some of the top pressing problems that were identified by that survey of several hundred operators and management of water utilities. Excuse me. For those who implement succession plans or succession planning processes, there are some common pitfalls. One is keeping it a secret. Sometimes we don't like to tout our own work, draw attention to the things that we're doing because either we're modest or we're afraid that attention may bring unwanted additional attention or questions. But I think by letting people know what you're doing, it makes it transparent. It gets buy-in, both from decision makers but also from staff. Underestimating the talent within. Session on evaluation, on staff evaluation, and we have a number of tools of workbooks essentially that help managers managers, people who oversee staff, identify some of the talents and skills and ranking those folks in the matrix to figure out how to best invest in personnel moving into the future. And that leads into the next bullet, narrow-minded thinking. This person's too old or too young or too rough or whatever. Sometimes we underestimate our staff. Also focusing exclusively on hard skills. Those are the licenses and the degrees and the qualifications, but also thinking about the soft skills. So maybe this person doesn't have the 3A certification, but they certainly do do a very good job of getting along well with everybody and working as a team. Not offering training and development opportunities, expecting employees to self-identify. Some folks need to be asked or recognized for their effort. Not everyone is going to step up and suggest their own intended path for career development. Not holding managers accountable for succession planning. not all succession has to be upward. There can be lateral succession, and I think sometimes folks don't think about that. And again, I've talked about succession planning as not being a one-size-fits-all program. And one of the worst things you can do, I think, is producing too many candidates for too few spots and maybe raising expectations unnecessarily. So there are 5 steps really to succession planning. And the first is stakeholder support. So really, as I mentioned a minute ago about keeping it secret, you want to institutionalize the process so you can capture stakeholder support. And I know we use the term stakeholder too much, and it almost doesn't mean anything anymore. And there's really no one literally holding a stake. But we're talking about senior leadership. If it's a town water district, maybe the board, the mayor, the supervisor, the decision makers, HR, civil service, union representatives, employee groups. You want to make sure all these folks are at the table, engaged, and you'll get their buy-in. Demonstrating why it's needed and what the benefits are to all those folks. And then some of that information I've already presented to you, albeit in bullet form. But certainly those are some of the ways you can address the need to some of those folks. And then a lot of those folks become great resources to you as you go through the succession planning process. Then you want to identify the strategic vision and goals of the organization. So again, depending on your size, you may have, as a utility or town, a mission statement. Or you may have a strategic plan, a master plan, a comprehensive plan, or you may not. But what are the goals of the town or the utility or the business? Where do you want to go? Where do you see yourself in the future? And that helps drive succession planning, because again, if you have X number of employees today, just say you have 5 employees today, 2 will leave within 5 years, and in 10 years you really see incredible growth in your town. You may think differently about how you rebuild that capacity. If you see a pretty much stagnant growth in the requirement for your water service, you may just do a one-on-one succession plan and replace those people directly. And then you want to clearly define the objectives for the program. And some of those I've kind of mentioned already today too. The objective isn't to replace Carl. The objective is to ensure quality service at the most affordable and efficient way possible, while providing a great work environment for the professionals who work there. So step 2, assessing your needs. So step 2 is really a 3-part process. It is as is. So what are we today? You take a snapshot of who you are as a utility or a town or an organization today. Where do you want to be, or where do you see the need for you to be? And you can define that timeline, 5 years, 10, 20. And again, we'll get into that in a little bit. But to be, and then C, the gap analysis. So you really look at what's between where you are today and where you need to be in X number of years, and what steps do you need to take, and that's the gap analysis. So step 2A is the as-is assessment. And so these are some of the things you need to think about in that as-is assessment. How many people do you expect to retire? Are there new leaders being developed? Are you identifying new leaders? What's the average age and tenure of current employees? What are attrition and vacancy rates? So do you have a high turnover? And if so, why? And if you don't know why, consider conducting exit interviews. Is it pay? Is it lack of support? Is it poor management? Is it just because people are attracted to bigger and better jobs elsewhere? Then you want to identify and prioritize your key work processes and positions. So who or what positions are most critical? Which have the least amount of resource depth? In other words, you have one guy who is mission critical, and there's really nobody else who can back him up should something happen to him tomorrow. That is very shallow resource depth. Versus you have a lab, and you've got 3 guys in the lab, and there's some redundancy there, and should one guy be sick for a few months, the lab will continue to go on without him until he returns. So other questions to think about: which processes are documented? Are future candidates prepared? Always thinking about people who could be great assets to your utility. Even if there's no job pending, it's good to kind of keep that network going. And there's ways to do that. And again, we discussed that through our through our recruitment session that we provide. But in short, you can do that through networking through professional organizations, communicating with peer utilities, etc. Sometimes even working through some of the consulting firms as well. And then identify condition and availability of resources. What items are needed to do the work? What do you have? Is it accessible and up to date? What technology do you need, or excuse me, do you have? And then you want to review your workforce, and I mentioned a little bit about this in the previous slide. Age, years of experience, their competencies and skills. Again, this is the KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities. Workforce breakdown: are they managers? Are they lab staff, operators, maintenance? Do they work on the lines? You also want to consider what kind of licenses you have and where they are along the lines with the rest of this information. And then it's sometimes helpful to map that in a four quad matrix, such as the one that we see here right now. Medium risk, so you can see along the X and Y axes, organizational impact and probability of vacancy. So if you map the probability of vacancy first, and then you think about who's leaving and what's the impact. And obviously the low risk folks are probably going to be less of a vulnerability to the utility. The high risk will be much greater. But this helps to make sure that you're focusing your efforts on the places, the skills, the positions that you need or that are most critical and have the highest probability of vacancy. And then doing an environmental scan. So what this really means, again, if you had a strategic plan or a mission or a master plan, comprehensive plan, thinking about what does the community see as its vision for itself, and how does your utility, your organization supplement, support that vision. And other external trends. Is your town, is your community growing? Are you finding yourself under increasing regulatory constraints? Are you compliant? And if you're not, why not? And how can we adjust? How can you adjust in the future to ensure that you can be? And also as part of the environmental scan, looking at the needs and opportunities for internal skill and talent development. How do you capture knowledge and transfer it within your organization? All too often, all the organization is kept in one's head and not necessarily on paper or in a place where other people can access it. There's many ways to do knowledge transfer, and particularly in this day and age with the technology that we have, I think it offers a more efficient opportunity for knowledge transfer to take place. Also in the environmental scan, looking at the labor market and how that might impact the availability of talent needed, and thinking about your community or the region or the place that you serve. Is that community aging? Is your infrastructure aging? Are your ratepayers aging? Is the population declining? Or alternatively, is your population growing? Are you building new infrastructure? Where do you want to be? Where do you need to be? I use the term sometimes skating to the puck. So where does a utility need to be to support the community it serves in 5 or 10 years? And you use that information to help build your comprehensive plan. So step 2B is the 2B assessment. And a little bit of this can be like looking into a crystal ball, because you're not necessarily going to have all the concrete data that you need to make these predictions. But I think that it's still important to think about them. And like my last statement about the community and whether it's aging or growing, if it's poor or affluent, whether your infrastructure is old and will need replacement, and what that means to the ratepayer and to the utility, all of those things are part of this to-be assessment, and thinking about what kind of staff you're going to need to support the utility of the future. And so step 2C is the gap analysis. And so you write down what your current state is, your as is. You write down your desired state, or where you think you're going to need to be, the to be, and then your action plan becomes that gap. All right. So if we need to get here from here, then we need to do these things. And so then that becomes the basis for looking at your succession plan, your personnel. And of course, part of that gap analysis could focus on the utility itself. We need to reinvest in our pipes and our pumps and our capital, of course. But for the succession planning process, you're also looking at the investment in your personnel. So for step 2C, some more questions to ponder. Do your current utility demographics, again, this is positions, skills, etc., look like the future ones? How are you going to handle any demographic shifts? Do your people have the skills or the ability to grow to keep up with the change? Which processes are most susceptible to changes in personnel? When are we most susceptible to losing essential knowledge? And then thinking about the system and the resources. What information do you need? Do you think you'll need in the future? What information needs to be more accessible by more people? Obviously, people who work within the utility. And then what kind of technology changes could you foresee? And then again, looking at the knowledge, skills, and abilities. What will future employees, what kind of knowledge, skills, and abilities will your future employees likely require? So after you do all of that, and it sounds like a lot of work, and for some utilities, it may be, particularly the larger ones, where you have a much more complex system and also a much more complex employment system as well. Many more people operating the plant, the utility. But even for smaller utilities, this can seem like a daunting task. But to ask yourself a few of these questions and to think about it is really the first step. And it doesn't require writing down answers to everything. It requires the thinking of how are we going to move forward and what steps do we need to take. And sometimes, particularly for smaller utilities, it may just be a few additional steps to ensure that you can move into the future gracefully. But you do want to start thinking about all of these things. All right, so developing the succession plan model. So you want to really look at which employees or levels of employees will be involved in the program. Again, for smaller utilities, it may be everyone. For larger utilities, you may decide on certain departments or maybe certain levels. So maybe you don't include maintenance staff or the folks who are going out in trucks and working on the lines from a day-to-day basis, or maybe you do, but that's for you to decide. And then looking at the leadership pipeline, and I know I'm talking an awful lot about leadership, but you'll find that you probably already know there's a certain number of managers and decision makers that work within our utilities, and you want to make sure that as much as possible you can promote from within, because that really supports the utility and helps to keep that kind of workplace fabric strong. But you want to look at the knowledge, skills, and abilities and the way that people can develop and grow, and not everybody can, and that's fine, and some people choose not to. But analyze the external sources of talent. So once you've look at the sources of talent you have within, what additional sources of talent are at your are available to you should you choose to use them. And then looking at training and development strategies. So formal professional development, often you can do this through AWWA, through WIA and other similar organizations that provide professional training, and certainly ourselves, the EFCs. Coaching and mentoring, sometimes essentially an apprenticeship. You know someone's going to retire, you bring someone up or bring someone new on to work with that person for a number of months or however long to make sure that that knowledge is transferred, that skill set, that you're not losing too much when you lose that employee. Job shadowing and identifying career paths are other options, as well as cross-training and developing folks with multiple skills so they can serve in multiple roles, which is great because they can provide redundancy across the utility should some position come unfilled, or for some period of time they can fill in. And for the smaller utilities, this multi-skilling is probably already happening to a degree. You want to develop retention strategies. Again, this is something we have a session on as well. There's a number of ways to essentially keep people in the positions that you want them in, and then create knowledge management and transfer strategies, and there's a number of ways to do that as well. So a succession planning model could look something like this, right? So you have on the left a succession planning element, build a leadership pipeline. So what's your objective? Ensure the sustainability of organizational leadership. So what are the things you're going to do that? Leadership competency development plan. So who is able to be a leader, and how do we get them there? Leadership talent pool development. Essentially, once you figure out who that group of potential leaders are, then you do some professional development to see whether or not that potential becomes a reality. And then leadership mentoring. Once you have a few leaders that potentially can shift laterally or upward into a more managerial or leadership role, mentoring them with other leaders. And so you see on the right, you develop your succession planning element, and then you walk through it into action items to the far right. Another example, just to share another, would be the element of developing retention strategies, right? So the planning objective would be to increase ability to retain key staff. So the tools would be to update and modify compensation and classification system, create a career path planning document, and then do cross-training and work rotation. So this is just an example. Yours could look very different. Your tools could look very different. Obviously, your elements and objectives could as well. But it could be something as simple as a table in Microsoft Word or in Excel that helps you create your succession planning process. So once you've created that model and you've given yourself a number of to-dos, then you implement that succession plan. So there's a lot of things to think about, and again, sometimes some of these will be more important than others, but there's a lot of things to think about when it comes to implementing your succession plan. Determine what resources you need, and that's really time and a little bit of money too, and of course we all know time is money. Identifying your barriers to implementation. Did you get adequate buy-in, or do you really need the HR manager's time to help you implement this, but the HR manager doesn't exactly have a lot of time for you right now, and so maybe you have to wait a few weeks or a few months until they have more time. Sometimes you have to update or develop job descriptions. Again, maybe you're not doing a one-for-one replacement. You're not replacing Carl with somebody else. You're deciding that Carl's position needs to change or grow or go away. And so that often means creating new job lines, creating new job descriptions, and eliminating old ones. and that takes time as well. You have to move people around, you have to work with civil service and other types of things. Prepare the organization for change. You can do this in a lot of different ways, through kind of staff workshops, through maybe after-hours social events where people begin to feel more comfortable talking and chatting and sharing their concerns. There's a lot of ways to prepare the organization for change. Establish a communication plan. And sometimes when I use the word plan, I think for some folks, including myself, it's like, oh boy, this sounds like a big document. But it doesn't have to be. A communication plan is send a monthly memo to all employees updating folks on how we're going through this process. Simple. And you just put that on the calendar and say, this month we've been able to move forward on X, Y, and Z. Connect with stakeholders and get their buy-in. Again, this is something to be doing in step one, but it's something that you need to be doing throughout the process. And then recognition and workforce planning, assessment strategies, recruitment strategies, and then training staff as necessary. And then you want to obviously link your succession strategies with any human resources efforts that are taking place as well. And so a little bit more on implementation. So depending on your size, again, you may want to develop a pilot program, maybe just in one department. If you're kind of joint sewer and water, or environmental services where you do both solid waste and wastewater, maybe you do one of those departments. Or if you are wastewater or water, maybe you focus on the operators or just the lab or something like that at first. And again, it depends on your size. But you want to track and measure how your implementation is going. Employee satisfaction is, I think, probably the utmost importance. You want to maintain high morale. But you also want to look at turnover as an indicator of that. You want to look at the number of individuals promoted versus outside hires, number of ready now candidates. So these are folks who are maybe not even employed by the utility, but they're in one position now and they're ready to go into another position should that position become available. They have the skills, they have the desire, and you have the confidence in their ability. A diversity of talent pools is very important. It allows you to be more nimble in your staffing requirements and in the size of the talent pool. Do you feel like you have enough candidates waiting in the wings, if you will, that even if it's 5 years from now, out of that number of candidates, 1 or 2 may still be available so that you can call them in if they're interested and available. And then communicating the program, again, using multiple methods, memos, in-person meetings, maybe one-on-one verbal communication, presenting to the town board. Obviously, you want to keep your employees engaged and work with HR and the union to make sure that the message is fully supported by all the folks that work with you. And again, you just want to share with everyone how it's going from time to time. All right, and so finally, the last step is to measure, evaluate, and adapt. You might know offhand that something is working well, but documenting it is really important. So measurements, continuous evaluation, and when I say evaluation, I mean your succession program evaluation, not necessarily your staff evaluation. Those are different things. And your adaptation. Things aren't always going to work the way you want them to. Maybe you had a sudden and unexpected vacancy that you had not planned for. So how do you adapt in that case? So first, in order to measure, you have to define what success is for you, and then you can measure against that. Determine the frequency of program evaluation. Maybe this is something you conduct once a year, every 6 months, again, depending on your size. For smaller utilities, maybe it's kind of just inherent in your day-to-day that you can see that what you need to do is getting done, vacancies are being filled, and your qualified staff pool is stable. You may want to consider designing a reporting process. Again, all of those stakeholders who you need their buy-in at the beginning of this process are going to want some sort of report back. And so what does that look like, and what does the process look like? Tracking progress, communicating, celebrating programs of success. I think celebrating is very important because I think, again, it boosts morale, it makes people feel safe, it makes people feel like you want to invest in them should they choose to continue to invest in you through their position. Getting feedback is important. I talked a little bit about the adjustment and adaptation. And then, you want to make this 3 to 5 year succession plan part of the strategic planning process. So again, should you undergo, or your utility organization or community undergo, some sort of strategic planning process, be thinking about how to integrate the succession plan into that. What does that strategic plan mean for the utility, and how does the utility need to change or grow in order to meet the needs, the desires of this strategic plan? So, the focus of this Smart Management for Small Water Systems program that Savannah overviewed at the beginning of this webinar is really focused on small systems. I noticed again in the registration in the poll, we have a lot of large systems. That's great. We're glad to help you, and we're glad you're here. But also thinking about the small systems. So what's a small system to do? Or what's a system with not a lot of capacity to think about succession planning supposed to do? One thing you can do is just create an organizational chart. Who works here? Who reports to who? And where are they, essentially, in the chain of command, if you will. And then separately, list age, years of service, and knowledge, skills, and abilities, certifications, degrees, the things that they can do that support through their position. Then develop a staffing matrix. And so this is that 4-quad matrix I shared several slides ago, where you have the low risk, medium risk, high risk employees, with the X and Y axis being chance of vacancy and how critical that vacancy would be for the organization. And then once you've done that, looking at, starting obviously with the high impact, when do you expect people to leave, and where do you expect to get those replacements? If they're abundant and readily available, okay, good. If not, then you need to think about recruitment and where are you going to get those folks from, and how are you going to ensure that that they have the skills needed to fill that role. And then, so do you need to develop them in advance? Can you start recruiting people from civil service exams so they're ready to go, if that applies to you, so they're ready to go when the time is right? And as part of recruitment, again, are you looking at trade schools, at the military, and maybe even minorities? And the reason I mention a couple of these is there's actually, through the Department of Labor, the Federal Department of Labor, there's a few, I'll call them grant programs that support the hiring of veterans and minorities particularly. There's a couple of programs to hire veterans that they'll actually pay 75% of their salary for the first 6 months that you employ them. So there's great benefit to thinking about some of these specific groups of potential employees. So there's other things to think about, retooling. Are there alternative ways to get the work done? So-and-so's been doing this job the same way for 30 years, but is that the only way to do that job? Are there other ways to get that job done? And you can sometimes think more creatively about that by looking to your peer utilities and see how they do things. Reinvention, or should the job be done at all? Again, looking at your peer utilities to see how they do things. Think about redundancy. We've talked about this a little bit already. Cross-training, multi-skilling, maybe hiring back a retiree or a part-timer. Looking at outside sources of talent, and sometimes even consultants or contractors. And maybe there are some things that are kind of discrete skill sets that you may not be able to develop, or you may not need to support full-time, like payroll, maintenance and grounds, instrumentation and control, electrical. Maybe those things, if not already, can be outsourced. But also, you want to identify the mission-critical positions and tasks. So if this skill set, this license, this person suddenly became unavailable, which is a euphemism for dying or quitting or getting fired, can you function properly, or will something really bad happen if they leave? And sometimes it's not something that's readily apparent. Maybe it's a person who processes payroll. Everybody wants to get paid. Does everybody know how to process payroll? So to wrap up, recruiting, and this is just thinking less about succession planning and thinking about the whole pipeline of developing staff, from recruitment through retention to succession, leadership, et cetera. Thinking about how you brand yourself, and going through the succession planning process, I think is kind of informative. And how do we talk about ourselves as an industry, as a water industry? And certainly as an individual utility or organization. So you may want to think about the branding, the language you use to communicate about the work that we do. And then to the recruitment, reach new markets through new avenues. The internet's really made it a lot easier for people to both post and apply for jobs. And there's a lot of different ways, and very specific ways, to start developing a candidate pool. Also through creating that pipeline of taking people out of trade school or college or even high school, and kind of grooming them, if you will, for a potential position with your utility. And then, staff really require investment. Recognition is always a good thing, and reinvestment. And then, like I said, wrapping up, planning for folks to leave. That's today. That was succession planning. So just a few things for you to think about. What succession planning components are you already doing? Do you have a bunch of names of people who are potentially leaving written down on the back of an envelope somewhere? And then what can you do to begin your succession planning process? Writing down those names on the back of an envelope somewhere is the beginning. And then in the next 3 months, challenge yourself with this question. In the next 3 months, I will do what? And maybe that is beginning to talk to the board or upper management about, or the superintendent about the need for developing a candidate pool, the need of, analyzing, doing that to-be analysis, the as-is analysis of the organization, and then following up with the to-be analysis of the organization. So think about what the things you can do in the next few months to start the succession planning process. And we here at the Environmental Finance Center, through the Small Systems Program, are always here to help, and happy to share with you any of the worksheets or guidebooks, a lot of the tools that we have that can help you along the way. So I thank you for participating in today's webinar. We have a few minutes for questions, and I think we probably have a few questions. So I will let Savannah read those off, and then I'll answer them as best as I can.
Thank you, Chris. Our first question is, can you ever have too much communication? Should a good succession plan include mentors to help get new employees up to speed and engaged?
So two-part question. So yes, there can be too much communication. And I think where we are, where I work, sometimes we get too much communication. And it's like, I don't need to know this right now, and tell me how this applies to me. And so One example for utilities in the succession planning process is at the beginning when you engage stakeholders, you want to tell them how this affects them, why this should be important to them, and then use that same frame in your communications as you move forward. No matter how big or how small a utility is, I could not imagine updating your staff on the succession planning process every week. That's too much communication. For some of you, maybe even most of you, every month might be too much. Every quarter, probably good. And keep in mind, unless you have folks who have said that they're retiring in December, and you have a lot of folks who said they're retiring in December, the succession planning process does not necessarily have to be swift. And if you have people who said that they're retiring at the end of 2017, you need to get rolling, but it's not drop-dead, fire on the desk urgency today. So the communications should really be comparable to the level of investment and amount of time and kind of the level of urgency your succession planning process takes. The second part of that question was about mentorship. And yes, I think mentoring is very important. When I talked a lot about leadership today, or I mentioned it several times anyway, I think just as important as developing good leaders is developing good mentors. Not everybody who's been there for 20 or 30 years, who's risen close to the top of the organization, is going to be a good mentor. Some people don't have the time, some people don't have the personality or the soft skills to be good mentors. So identifying good mentors helps you to develop not only the leadership pipeline, but the kind of career path development for folks who work for your utility.
Thank you. And this is another two-part question. How do you feel about the use of skills surveys kept up to date as part of a succession plan? But also, what are your thoughts about the online training for employees to improve their skills while on the job?
So the first question, I think skill surveys are great, but I think they have to be done in a way that doesn't make people feel that they should, you don't want to make people feel threatened. So if they have the perception that the skill survey is more of an evaluation, you know, I think of the old 90s movie Office Space, where they hired a management consultant who came in and said, tell me what you do here. And he put everybody on edge. That's not what you want to do. I think you might precede a skill survey with, so you want to do two things before you do a skill survey. If you're not already doing annual evaluations of your staff, you want to do that. And that annual evaluation should include, essentially, it could include many things, but it should essentially include at least two components. One, what is that person's goal for the next year? What are the things that they want to do, job-related, in the next year? And then also the supervisor's evaluation of the previous year's work. And then an agreement on how best to help that employee achieve those goals. So you want to do that. And then you want to, and through that, you can have a conversation of, so where do you really want to go? Where do you really want to go here in this organization? And then I think you have that skill survey so that people don't feel threatened. You have a better idea of whether the skills they have today are going to be the same skills they have in 2 months or 2 years, or if their intention is to grow that skill set. And then you take that skill survey and you enter it into the matrix. So you see what skills you have across what personnel, and then you can figure out how your positions need to be filled, changed, or migrated somewhere else. And I know we're running out of time here, so let me finish the second question. And any other questions that that we might not have been able to answer, I will answer electronically in the coming days and share with everybody who registered for this webinar. So the other question was, what are your thoughts about online training for employees to improve their skills while on the job? I think online training is great. It's hard for us as training providers. It's very hard for us to offer CEUs By the way, everybody will get a certificate that you can self-report for your continuing education credits. But many states don't yet support webinars for credits. And so if that's the case, then it's hard for you to maybe incentivize your employees to watch webinars. I think webinars are cost effective. They're usually free or inexpensive when compared to workshops or conferences. So while some trade organizations, many in fact, still charge for webinars $30, $40, $100. Those costs are usually less or comparable to a workshop or conference registration cost. And then when you add time away and travel and other things like that, a webinar becomes very cost effective for utility, particularly for remote, rural, small utilities. If you can sit at your desk for an hour and learn something, that saves you a trip 2 hours away for a half-day workshop that essentially kills your whole day. So I think in the future we're going to see much more growth in the online training and much more support through the states and those who certify them for training in the very near future. So with that, I want to wrap up. I think Savannah still has a couple of poll questions she wants to share with you, and then we'll thank you for joining us this afternoon.
All right, quickly before we wrap up, just 2 more polling questions. The first polling question is if you would like to subscribe to the Environmental Finance Center blog. If you want to sign up for the blog but do not have the opportunity to submit your polling answer today, you can sign up for the blog on our efcnetwork.org website. I'm closing the poll now. And the next poll is if you are a small water system of 10,000 or fewer people served, would you be interested in receiving in-depth technical assistance? If you are unsure about technical assistance or do not have the opportunity to submit your polling answer today, please review the technical assistance form on our efcnetwork.org website. I'm getting ready to close the poll now. And lastly, I am pushing out a survey link in the chat box. Please just take a few seconds out of your day to follow up on your thoughts about the webinar today. And you will also receive a follow-up email tomorrow with the survey link as well as a link to the slides and recording. Thank you, Chris, so much for a thorough and detailed succession plan webinar.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Have a great day.